it's always good to see that Nikos also has an event. So, worth coming here. We're always in a sort of feeling that the main building has more events, and we're jealous, you know. So when we see Grand Parade coming past, we're quite happy. It's a great pleasure to introduce Tim Ingold, who is a professor and chair of social anthropology at the University of Aberdeen. He has written extensively. He's a social anthropologist, but actually crosses all sorts of boundaries. And he writes about archaeology, art, architecture, anthropology in a very illuminating way for architects. One of the things that I really like about his work personally was how he was criticizing what I would call probably the Albertian notion of precision and thinking about architecture and drawing in the mind. And he was always saying that between the architects' kind of these pristine, superbly nicely drawn kind of drawings that we do sometimes, there is the world of when you're on site, the builder's world, and that builder's world has a kink, and it's never really quite straight and pristine, and it's very messy, and that's where the builders actually have that kink. And I like the words that he uses because they really kind of start to be visualized in architects' mind. Having said that, I quite deliberately took him through our studios to see that we do models and we do inhabit the kink. At least in this school, we try to make making a part of our particular list, and also have drawings as well as computer drawings. Tim has written a number of books which are useful to architects and interior designers. Some of them are called, some of you read them, I'm sure, but the latest one on the lines I haven't read yet. I read the lines of brief history, I read the Being Alive and the Movement book, which I find very exciting, and there is a number of research strands in his from an anthropological approach to the world, which is actually investigating urban communities, from investigating that to writing about environment, to writing about technology, and all of that somehow gives pictures to architects and visual artists. So please welcome Tim Ingold. It's a great pleasure. It took 1.5 years to get him down to Brighton. So welcome.
Well, thank you very much. And, architecture, I'm always bumping into new disciplines, and by mistake. And people come along and tell me that, did you realize that you're working in this discipline or that discipline? And that's happened to be with architecture, that I didn't realize that I was doing architecture. I was writing about lines, and people said, don't you realize that what you're doing is architecture? So that's what I thought, to find out something about this architecture, what it is. And so I bumped into architecture by accident.
Would you like a bit more light?
Otherwise I won't be able to see what I've got in front of me.
Yeah.
So just remember that I'm not an architect. I'm really that's fine.
Can we control it a bit? Switch the back. Like that? Is that better? No.
You put those.
You can see that.
Yeah.
That's anyway, yes, that's perfectly all right.
Is that okay?
I can read this. Yes.
Is this okay?
Yeah, that's absolutely fine. So, and the other thing is that what I'm presenting here is not very well wrapped up, because I just finished a book called The Life of Lines, which is coming out in April. And this is a kind of excerpt, if you like, from some of the early chapters of the book. So they don't really add up to something that's very self-contained, but gives some sort of flavour as to what I'm on about. The novelist Italo Calvino is writing about knots. And he says, in the knot, I'm going to just read this out, the intersection between two curves is never an abstract point, it is the actual point where one end of a rope or cord or line or thread either runs or turns or is tied above or below or around itself or around another similar item as a consequence of very precise actions carried out by practitioners of a range of crafts, from the sailor to the surgeon, the cobbler to the acrobat, the mountaineer to the seamstress, the fisherman to the packer, the butcher, to the basket maker, the carpet maker, to the piano tuner, the camper, to the chair mender, the woodcutter, to the lace maker, the bookbinder, to the racket maker, the executioner, to the necklace maker. Well, it comes as no surprise that Calvino begins his list of practitioners with the sailor, nor is it any accident that the language of knots and knotting pervades every aspect of life at sea, because it's here that finding a place and holding fast in a fluid medium presents its greatest challenges. Knots fasten the rigging of a ship, hold it at anchor, are used to measure speed, and in the past were sold to sailors as magical means to release the wind. But knots are also fundamental elements of woven structures, such as nets and baskets. And writing in the middle of the 19th century, in a treatise on the origins and evolution of architecture, Gottfried Semper asserted that the knotting of fibres in net making and basketry was among the most ancient of human arts, from which all else was derived, including both building and textiles. The beginning of building, Semper declared, coincides with the beginning of textiles. And on the side of building, knotting evolved from the plaiting of sticks and branches to more elaborate techniques for constructing the frame of the house. And on the side of textiles, according to Semper, basketry and the plaiting of fibres led to techniques of weaving, to woven pattern, and thence to the knotted carpet. I'm going to return to Semper in what follows, but my more immediate purpose is to suggest that in a world where things are continually coming into being through processes of growth and movement, that is, in a world of life, knotting is a fundamental principle of coherence. It's the way that forms are held together and kept in place within what would otherwise be a quite formless and inchoate flux. And this applies as much to forms of knowledge as to material things, whether they're made like artifacts or grown like organisms. But in the recent history of modern thought, knots and knotting have been largely sidelined. And the reasons for this are to be found in the power of an alternative set of closely linked metaphors. These are the building block, the chain, and the container. Though increasingly challenged in fields ranging from particle physics and molecular biology to cognitive science, these metaphors still retain much of their appeal. And they lead us to think of a world which is not so much woven from ever unspooling strands as assembled from pre-cut pieces. In this vein, psychologists continue to speak of the building blocks of thought and of the mind as a container equipped with certain capacities for acquiring epistemic content. Linguists speak of the semantic content of words and their enchainment in syntax. Biologists often refer to the DNA of the genome in rather similar terms, both as a genetic chain and as a plan for assembling the building blocks of life, while physicists, in their exploration of the chain reactions of subatomic particles, aim to discover nothing less than the fundamental building blocks of the universe itself. However, a world assembled from perfectly fitting, externally bounded blocks could harbour no life. Nothing could move or grow. And so the block, chain, container and the knot represent mutually exclusive master tropes for understanding the constitution of the world, predicated on philosophies respectively of being and becoming. So the challenge, I think, is to consider how a reversion to the knot, after a period during which blocks, chains and containers have remained the paramount figures of thought, how would this impact on our understanding of ourselves, of the things we make and do, and of the world we live in? And to help frame our questions, it might help to begin by determining what a knot is not. Specifically, first, the knot is not a building block. Blocks are assembled into structures, knots are bound or tied into nodes or nodules. And so the order of the block is explicit, in that each is joined to the other by external contact or adjacency. The order of the knot is implicate, in that the constitutive strands of each knot, as they extend beyond it, are bound into others. Secondly, the knot is not a chain. Chains are articulated from rigid elements or links and retain their connections even when the tension is released, and yet they have no memory of their formation. Knots, by contrast, are not articulated and they don't connect. They have no links. Nevertheless, they retain within their constitution a memory of the process of their formation. And then thirdly, the knot is not a container. Container have insides and outsides. In the topology of the knot, however, it is impossible to say what is inside or outside. Rather, knots have interstices. Their surfaces don't enclose, but lie between between the lines of the materials that make them up. So what then would a world be like that is knotted rather than assembled, enchained, and contained? Well, one possible vision of such a world comes from the writing of the Japanese architect Akihisa Hirata, called Tango. He describes how an alpine view of pleated mountains swathed in clouds, shot through with beams of sunlight, led him to think of an entangled order in which mountains and clouds draw one another into configurations that cause ever further tangles, yielding a scene of life imbued with unalterable complexity. So I wonder, is there a connection between thinking through knotting and this understanding of the inhabited world as the interpenetration of earth and sky with its crumples, creases and folds, rather than as a solid globe surrounded by its gaseous atmosphere upon the outer surfaces of which the architecture of the built environment is erected? There can, of course, be no knots without the performance of knotting, so we should therefore commence with the verb to knot and view knotting as an activity of which knots are the emergent outcomes. Thus conceived, knotting is about how contrary forces of tension and friction, as when you pull something tight, are generative of new forms. And it's about how forms are held in place within such a force field, or in short, it is about making things stick. So accordingly, our focus should be on forces and materials rather than on form and content. So then, knotting registers in a number of domains as thought and practice in which patterns of culture are sustained and bound into the interstices of human life. And these include, first, the flows and growth patterns of materials, including air, water, cordage, and wood. Secondly, bodily movement and gesture, as in weaving and sewing. And thirdly, sensory perception, especially touch and hearing, perhaps more than, but not to the exclusion of vision. And then fourthly, human relationships and the sentiment that infuses them. And I take these domains to be on a par ontologically. That is, none is more fundamental or more derivative. So our task is not to explain any one in terms of any other, nor should we treat knotting as in any one as literal and in any other as metaphorical. Rather, the question is how to translate from domain to domain. So to begin with materials, it's important here to note a second sense in which knots and knotting can be understood. In this sense, a knot is formed whenever the materials of growing life forms wrap around each other so as to form a lump or nodule. This is most obvious in the case of the growth of trees, although it might be extended to concretions or swellings in animal tissues, and even by analogy to rocky outcrops of similar conformation and texture. So the tree knot is a whorl in the grain that develops as the material of an expanding trunk or limb envelops that of an emerging branch. Since the branch is simultaneously growing, the material of the knot is compressed into a hard core. And although knots are what hold the tree together, in their density and the distortion of the grain, they also present the greatest challenge, of course, to the carpenter. And this might offer a clue to the relation between knots of the first kind and those of the second. The latter are formed in a process of enlargement and differentiation in the extrusion of material along lines of growth. But the former, the knots you could tie in a string, entail the manipulation of lines like fibers, threads, cords, or ropes, which are already grown. Now, knot tying of this kind is by no means exclusive to humans, and weaver birds do it in the construction of their nests, as do certain apes, at least when raised in proximity to humans. Nevertheless, Semper may have had a point in placing the origins of technicity with the capacity to form knots in one sense and to slice through them in the other, that is, in the complementarity of weaving and carpentry, of textiles and woodwork, finding etymological support for this belief in the cluster of words derived from the Greek tekton, allegedly related to the Sanskrit paksan, referring to carpentry, and the use of the axe in Sanskrit pasha. Ultimately, as the philologist Adolf Heinrich Baubein observes, the tectonic world would become, or the tectonic would become, the art of joinings. Now, what it actually means to join things is a theme that I'll come to in a moment. But with regard to bodily movement and gesture, which is the second register of knotting, the critical aspect, of course, is that the knot is tied. Tying always involves the formation of a loop through which the tip of the line is then threaded and tightened. The choreography of looping is to be of particular interest because of the way in which an arching or circular gesture that gathers in or retrieves the material simultaneously creates an opening through which it can be further propelled in a rhythmic alternation that bears comparison with the beating heart and the heaving lungs of a living body. Topologically, the heart, the human heart, in Latin cor, is a tube in the form of a knot, as is the French horn, also cor. In the body, the heart knot alternately gathers the life-sustaining arterial flows of blood and propels them onwards, just as the inhaling lungs gather the air into a vortex through which we then breathe out, like that, gathering in and then out. And then make a loop and then thread through it, just the same way as with the horn there. And the breath of the body corresponds in turn to the sonorous melodic line which issues from the knotted tubes of the horn when it is blown, or from the vocal cords when people sing. And of course, several voices layered in correspondence make up a chorus or a choir. So cor, chord, chorus, and choir all share the same root meaning of the knot. So then, how does knotting register in sensory perception? One answer, perhaps, is as music. Because what is music, if not the synergy of gestures of performance, currents of air, and vibrating chords, and correspondent sounds that touch the heartstrings of emotion? For considered as qualities of experience, sounds and feelings don't go from point to point, but loop and twist around one another as much as do the lines of choral polyphony or of a roundel dance. And in the forms of music and if the forms of music and dance are knots of sound and feeling, well, why shouldn't we regard architectural forms as knots of light? The builders of medieval cathedrals, who crowned their saints with halos while sounding their praises with the ringing of bells and garlanding their images, would certainly have understood this. For them, the wreath, the ring, and the halo, respectively felt heard and seen are of a kind. They would have understood too that untying as well as tying registers in perception nowhere more than in a storm with its thunder, lightning and wind, but also in the dwelling, where the fire of the hearth binds the circulations of affectivity and nourishment, and in a reverse movement of unbinding releases them to the atmosphere as smoke dispersed in the wind. There's long been a close association, especially in seafaring communities, between knots and the wind. To untie a knot is to let loose the wind. One knot releases a light breeze, the second a moderate one. Untie the third, and all hell will break loose. Tying and untying, then, lie at the core of the relation between the hearth and the wind, or more broadly, between society and cosmos. And then finally, in the field of human relationships, knotting is symptomatic of the binding of lives in relations of kinship and affinity. Here I can wear my anthropological hat. The children of a union, knit together, as the biblical psalm has it, in the same womb, are like lines that eventually go their separate ways, only to tie themselves with lines extending from other knots, thus spreading the mesh of kinship far and wide. And these life-historic lines are by the same token lines of feeling or sentiment, whose rooting for one another rests on what the social anthropologist Maya Fortis called the axiom of amity. For Fortis, kinship is equated with amity and non-kinship with its negation. Perhaps the tragedy of kinship is that its lines, bound at source, can only grow apart. Its promise lies in the discovery of other lines to bind with and the new life that issues from them. Together this breeds otherness, amity, alienation, and vice versa. But the binding can also be political. It lies, as the philosopher Hannah Arendt has it, in the reality of men's acting and speaking to one another, in that in-between, wherein they find their interests and in which is woven what she calls the web of human relationships. This in-between, the in-betweenness of the knot, is in the midst of things, rather than a liminal halfway house en route from means to ends. And it leads us to the question of how, in tying the knot, how might lives or materials be joined? Well, carpentry is otherwise known as joinery, or the carpenter is a joiner. But what is a join? And what does it mean to join things? Here I want to argue that the dominant metaphors of block, chain and container, which I introduced earlier, have led to a fateful equation of joining with articulation. They lead us to imagine a world comprised of rigid elements or blocks that are linked externally or end-chained, side to side or end to end. Whatever is not hard or solid is confined to or contained within the interior of these elements. So interiorities can't mix or mingle. They can only fuse in the constitution of compound elements in which any trace of joining immediately disappears. But surely articulation is not the only way to join things.
Did you want the horn back?
No, I don't want that. I want this.
Oh, okay.
Articulation is not the only way to join things. Another way to tie them together is some kind of knot. These pictures actually come from Semper's book, middle of the 19th century. Now, with knots, the things to be joined must be linear and flexible. They don't meet face to face on the outside, but in the very interiority of the knot. And they are joined neither end to end, nor side by side, but in the middle. Knots are always in the midst of things, while their ends are on the loose, rooting for other lines to tangle with. So tying and articulation look like two ways of joining that rest on entirely opposite principles. And the carpenter, which principle does he adopt? Well, you would think at first glance that he must opt for articulation. After all, who ever heard of knotting beams or planks of wood? Of course, it's possible to sew together adjacent planks by means of flexible windows or bricks, as is attested by some prehistoric forms of boat building. But you can't knot one plank with another. This, surely, is where the craft of carpentry differs from that of basketry. The basket maker works with flexible saplings rather than solid wood and weaves the strands in and out so that they always overshoot their points of contact. But the carpenter, for example in building a frame for a house, joins his solid timbers end to end, edge to side, or side to side. With the basket, the countervailing tensile and compressive forces of bent withes lend rigidity to the whole structure. With the house frame, the principal pressure points are in the joints themselves. Well, given these evident differences between carpentry and basketry, how could one possibly argue that the carpenter's joint is a species of knot? And yet this was precisely the argument proposed by Semper in his treatise of 1851 entitled The Four Elements of Architecture. I've already shown how Semper viewed carpentry and textiles as complementary practices within the overall field of the tectonic arts, with the knot as the most elementary operation common to both. Fascinated by etymology, Semper found support for his ideas in the affinity of the German words for knot, noten, and joint, nach, both of which appear to share the Indo-European root nok, N-O-C, whence come the words nexus and necessity. Now what's at stake here, as Semper was well aware, is more than just a question of technique. Rather, it touches on the more fundamental question of what it means to make things. The carpenter and the weaver are equally driven by the imperative of making. And for both there can be no making without joining. But the necessity of the knot is not a brittle one that allows for freedom only in the spaces left between, but a supple necessity that admits to movement as both its condition and its consequence. That's to say, it's not the necessity of predetermination, whose antonym is chance, but a necessity born out of commitment and attention to materials and the way they want to go. And its antonym is negligence. And in this regard, the carpenter's joint is absolutely not an articulation. Because in it, as in the knot, materials offer themselves to one another on the inside, yet without losing their identities in the composite whole. In cutting a mortise and tenon, for example, one piece is made ready to receive the other, such that in their subsequent interpenetration, hidden away in the interiority of the joint, that interpenetration is an enduring condition. So the tenon cut in the first piece, and that is offered to the mortise cut in the second, remains fully with the former even as it is received into the latter. And so it is too with the constituent lines of the knot. As with the knot, we might say that the pieces of timber are joined, but not joined up, because the adverb up connotes a finality that is belied by the ongoing life of the thing. It's no more joined up than used up. On the contrary, it carries on. And as it carries on, its joints or knots establish relations not of articulation, but of sympathy. Like lines of polyphonic music, whose harmony lies in their alternating tension and resolution, the parts possess an inner feel for one another and are not simply linked by connections of exteriority. And it's precisely because these parts abound in sympathy that it's through interstitial differentiation rather than external accretion. For that reason, that I am unwilling to use the currently fashionable term assemblage for the whole comprised of. This whole is a correspondence, not an assemblage, the elements of which are not joined up, but with. Whereas the design theorist and architect Lars Spoybrook explains, sympathy is a living with rather than a looking at, a form of feeling knowing that operates in the interstices of things, in their interiority. It is, as Spoybrook writes, what things feel when they shape each other. So in both carpentry and textiles, the form of a thing does not stand over it or lie behind it, but emerges from this mutual shaping. Within a gathering of forces, both tensile and frictional, established through the engagement of the practitioner with materials that have their own inclinations and vitality. So now, having established that both knot tying and joining are instances not of articulation but of sympathetic union, respectively bringing together flexible and rigid lines, the stage is set for recognizing all sorts of intermediate cases in which knotting and joining and rigid and flexible lines can be combined. Think of the ship's masts and its rigging, the goalposts and the net of a football pitch, the fisherman's rod and line, the archer's bow and bowstring, the weaver's loom and warp threads, or, more gruesomely, the hangman's gallows and the noose. But perhaps the most outstanding example is the human body. The body, a complex of knots and joints par excellence, whose members must be in sympathy if the person is to remain alive and well. I've already observed that the heart is a knot. The bones, however, meet at the joints. The parallel between well-joined wood and stone in the construction of temples and well-joined limbs in the body of the warrior, the one conferring resistance against violent weather, the other resistance against the violence of enemies, was a recurrent theme in Homeric poetry. And the same verb, ararisko, to join, commonly used for both, was one of a host of words based on the Indo-European root ar, from which are derived both arm and art, Latin armus, the arms of the warrior, and ars, the arts, and of course, articulation. And as we've seen, the suite of words derived from the joiner's art, tecton, including the Latin texere, to weave, originally converged upon much the same meaning. But for the poets and philosophers of classical Greece and Rome, the articulation of joints in the well-tempered body didn't have the anatomical significance that it subsequently acquired in modernity. It was associated more with ideals of beauty, poise, and fortitude. But today, of the bones of the skeleton, articulation is a word that only anatomists would use, or perhaps butchers. Theirs is an apprehension of the body as a corpse laid out upon the slab or on the dissecting table, and that's an apprehension divorced from life. For the living being, by contrast, the joint, which like the rest of the skeleton was never assembled, but was rather grown with the person to whom it belongs, the joint is not so much an exterior connection of rigid elements as an interior condition of sympathetic movement, bonded on the inside by means of a linear mesh of ligaments. This picture, which I like very much, comes from the sketchbook of the artist Paul Klee, and he's explaining how the joints of the body work. They hold together because they're embedded in those crisscross lines, the ligaments bind it up. Before leaving this matter of the join, it's necessary to add one further remark which concerns its opposite, and that is separation. An articulated structure comprised of end-chained elements can readily be taken apart, as happens, for example, with wagons in a railway yard. As the wagons are uncoupled, so the freight train is disarticulated. And likewise, bones that have been assembled in the forensic laboratory can subsequently be disassembled. But from all I've said up to now, it should be clear that the separation of elements that have been joined in sympathy cannot be understood in these terms. Because it's not just a matter of cutting an external connection, something has to give from the inside, and this bears on the question of memory. Comparing the chain and the knot, I've already noted that the chain has no memory. When you release the tension in a chain and let it fall to the ground, it comes to rest in a disordered heap. But if you untie a knotted rope, however much you try to straighten it, the rope will retain kinks and bends and will want, given the chance, to curl up in similar conformations as before. The memory is suffused into the very material of the rope in the torsions and flexions of its constituent fibres. And so it is too with timbers that have been joined. They might be pulled apart and used in other structures, but they will always retain a memory of their former association. So when we say that in separating something has to give from the inside, we mean that it is necessary to forget. An articulated structure, since it remembers nothing, has nothing to forget. But the knot remembers everything and has everything to forget. Untying the knot, therefore, is not a disarticulation. It doesn't break things into pieces. It's rather a casting off, whence lines that were once bound together go their separate ways. Thus it is with siblings in the family. Having grown up together, their leaving home is not a disassembly, but a dispersal, a shaking out of those lines of sympathetic differentiation, otherwise known as relations of kinship. And of course, in the knot of the navel, every one of us retains a memory of that originary moment when we first came into the world, only to be cast off with a cut. Well, now, the four dimensions of architecture, according to Semper, were the earthwork, the hearth, the framework, and the enclosing membrane. And to each of these he assigned a particular craft. Masonry for the earthwork, ceramics for the hearth, carpentry for the framework, and textiles for the membrane. But his overriding concern was with the relationship between the base of the building, the earthwork, and its frame, and thus with the relation between masonry and carpentry. And in more technical terms, this is to draw a distinction between stereotomics and tectonics. We've already encountered tectonics from the Greek tecton, a term that originally signified carpentry, but subsequently expanded in its range of reference to embrace the art of joinings in general. Stereotomics also has its roots in classical Greece, from stereo, meaning solid, and tomia, to cut. It's the art of cutting solids into elements that fit snugly together when assembled into a structure like a tower or a vault. And such heavyweight blocks are held in place simply by the gravitational force bearing down on those beneath and ultimately on foundations. In tectonics, by contrast, linear constituents are fitted into a frame that is held together by joints or bindings. One might think, for example, of the frame of a boat that has still to be covered with planks or skins, or the beams of a roof that has still to be thatched, slated, or tiled. For Semper in his day, and now for us, the key question is about the balance or the relative priority of stereotomics and tectonics in the making or building of things. In tectonics, the knot or the joint is the root principle of construction. In stereotomics, it is the heap. And whereas the heap gravitates towards the earth, a structure that is knotted or joined is typically suspended or elevated in the air. The architectural historian Kenneth Frampton has highlighted how these dialogically opposed modes of construction, as he calls them, point respectively to the affinity of the frame for the immateriality of the sky and the propensity of mass form not only to gravitate towards the earth, but to dissolve into its substance. But midway between earth and sky lies the ground. And at this point I want to return to a question I raised a short while ago that I haven't yet answered. What is the relation between thinking through knotting and our understanding of the ground? How might this understanding be altered? Were we to replace the architecture of the building block and the container, in which the interior is remodeled as a simulacrum of the exterior space, with the architecture of an earth-sky world that would re-establish the house as a knot in the fabric of the ground, where the stereotomic foundations meet the tectonic roof? And to make a start in answering these questions, I want to focus on a structure of near universal distribution, but one which in some ways confounds the distinction between stereotomics and tectonics, namely the wall. Is a wall assembled or woven? Is it heaped or is it joined? Is it of the earth or is it of the air? We tend to think of walls as made of such solid materials as mud, brick or stone, and of wall builders as masons or bricklayers. Ancient walls, having collapsed back into the earth from which their materials were once drawn, are often scarcely visible, and it might take a trained archaeological eye to detect their presence in the landscape. But perhaps we don't see the walls of old because they were not originally made from such solid and durable stuff at all, but rather from relatively lightweight and perishable organic materials, which would in time have literally melted into the air through exposure to the atmosphere and its effects. And that indeed was Semper's view, for he was convinced that the first walls were plaited from wicker and used as pens to keep domestic animals in, or as fences around fields and gardens to keep wild animals out. Following his thesis that both building and textiles shared a common origin in the plaiting of sticks and branches, he concluded that the first so-called wall fitters, Wandbereiter, were weavers of mats and carpets, noting in his support that the German word for wall, Wand, shares the same root word as the word for dress or clothing, Gewand. Now admittedly, the earthwork that comprised the foundations of a building could rise up into the very fabric of the building itself to form solid walls or fortifications of rock and stone. But Semper was careful to distinguish between the massiveness of the solid wall, indicated by the word Mauer in German, and the light screen-like enclosure, signified by the word Wand. And in relation to the primary function of the Wand wall, that is to enclose a space, Semper believed that the Mauer wall played a purely auxiliary role to provide protection or support. So the essence of wall building for him lay in the joining or knotting of linear elements of the frame and the weaving of the material that covered it. And even with the addition of stone walls and fortifications, wall building for Semper never lost its character as a textile art. Well, Semper's treatise on the four elements of architecture, when it was first published in 1851, was not well received, leaving figures in the histories of art and architecture lined up to ridicule it. Indeed, the idea that building could be a practice of weaving akin to basketry seemed as strange to Semper's contemporaries in the middle of the 19th century as it does to many readers today. It takes a bold intellect to question it. And one such was the eccentric philosopher of design, Wilhelm Schlosser. Writing in the final decades of the 20th century, Schlosser reminds us that for any structure that would afford some measure of protection from the elements, such as a tent, the first condition is not that it should withstand the force of gravity, but that it should not be swept away by the wind. And this leads him to compare the wall of the tent with the sail of a ship, or even the wing of a glider, the purpose of which is not so much to resist or break the wind as to capture it into its folds, or to deflect or channel it in a way that serves the interests of human dwelling. So what if we were to follow Schlosser and commence our understanding of walls by thinking about and with the wind, that is, by flying kites rather than building with blocks? Or rather like Semper before him, Flusser distinguishes two kinds of wall corresponding to bond and mauer. There's the screen wall, generally of woven fabric, and the solid wall, hewn from rock or built up from heavy components. And without going into the question of relative priority, this for Flusser is the difference between the tent and the house. The house is a geostatic assemblage of which the elements are held firm by the sheer weight of blocks stacked atop one another. The force of gravity allows the house to stand, but equally can bring it tumbling down. Within the cave-like enclosure formed by the four solid walls of the house, Flusser argues, things are possessed. Property is defined by walls, he says. The tent, by contrast, is an aerodynamic structure that would likely lift off were it not pegged, fastened, or anchored to the ground, and its fabric, screens, are wind walls. As a calming of the wind, a locus of rest in a turbulent medium, the tent, he says, is like a nest in a tree, a knot where people and the experiences and sentiments they bring with them come together, interweave, and disperse in a way that precisely parallels the treatment of fibres in fabricating the material from which the tent's screen walls are made. Indeed, the very word screen suggests to Flusser, I quote, a piece of cloth that is open to experiences, open to the wind, open to the spirit, and that stores this experience. So, as house is to tent, and as the containment of life's possessions over and against the world is to the knotting or binding of life paths in the world, so is the closure of the solid rock wall to the openness of the wind-blown screen wall. The screen wall blowing in the wind, Flusser writes, assembles experience, processes it, and disseminates it, and is to be thanked for the fact that the tent is a creative nest. Of course, like all sweeping generalizations, this is far too crude, and any attempt to classify built forms in these terms would immediately collapse under the weight of exceptions. There are tents that incorporate rock walls, and there are houses whose walls are screens. One only has to think, for example, of the walls of the traditional Japanese house, paper thin and semi-translucent. These walls defy any opposition between inside and outside and cast the life of inhabitants as a complex interplay of light and shadow. The traditional Japanese house, as Frampton has observed, belongs to a world that is woven throughout, from the knotted grasses and rice straw ropes of domestic shrines to tatami floor mats and bamboo walls. Indeed, in its commitment to the tectonic, Japanese building culture stands in stark contrast to that of the Western monumental tradition, with its emphasis on stereotomic mass. However, the general contrast between the geostatics of the rock wall and the aerodynamics of the wind wall remains. Independently of Flusser, but drawing directly on the pioneering work of Semper, Frampton takes us back to the foundational distinction between stereotomics and tectonics and the question of the balance between them. Traditions of vernacular building around the world reveal wide variations in this balance depending on climate, custom, and available material, from buildings such as the Japanese house, in which the earthwork is reduced to point foundations, while walls as well as roof are woven, to traditional urban dwellings in North Africa, where stone or mud brick walls arch over to become roof vaults of the same material, and in which brushwork or basketwork serves only as reinforcement. So in the first case, the stereotomic component, and in the second case, the tectonic component is reduced to a minimum. And then in some instances, materials are transposed from one mode of construction to the other, such as where stone is cut to resemble the form of a timber frame, as in the classical Greek temple. So what should we make of an ordinary brick wall? The bricklayer, to be sure, is a master of the block, piling row upon row in such a way that they press evenly and in equilibrium on those beneath and ultimately on the foundations. But he is also a master of the line, whose principal instruments, besides the trowel, are string and the pendulum pot. Now, a stereotomic perspective on the wall would lead us to perceive neatly stacked bricks and to regard the mortar as merely filling the gaps between them. But a tectonic perspective would reveal the wall to be a complex but continuous bonded fabric of mortar, in which it is the bricks that serve as gap fillers. So, is the wall a well-balanced heap of bricks, or is it a finely woven fabric? Is it stacked, or is it bonded? Well, clearly it is both. In the wall and its construction, the stereotomic and tectonic arts meet and merge. But then, what happens to the ground? One can point to the wall's many functions of spatial enclosure, protection and defence, but what becomes of the ground amidst the thickness of the wall? Is it still present, as the stereotomic model suggests, serving as a foundation, albeit now covered up, upon which the entire structure finds support? Or does the wall establish a kind of fold in the ground, between the outward facing surfaces of which the materials of the earth well up and bond into the fabric of brickwork as if through a fissure? And I want to conclude, if I can, am I going over time or am I all right?
You're right.
I'm all right. I'll do another 10 minutes.
Yeah.
I want to conclude in the following final section by showing that a tectonic model based on the principle of the knot leads inexorably to the latter conclusion. What's the difference, you might ask, between a mountain and a skyscraper? To build a skyscraper, you must first establish a solid foundation and infrastructure upon which the entire edifice, upon which the entire edifice
I know what it is.
will rest.
Oh, it's that one.
There it is.
Yeah.
Then, having got your infrastructure, then you will need a crane. The crane is a machine in the original sense of the term, that is, an instrument for lifting heavy weights. And it embodies a simple but very basic principle, namely that in order to build a structure up, it is necessary to drop the components down from on top. Thus, the crane has to be higher than the maximum height of the building. In any rapidly growing urban metropolis, the forest of cranes is the first sight that greets the visitor. Each crane is employed in picking up components from the ground of the building site, lifting them to a height above the level to which the construction has reached, and dropping them down again so that they can be placed atop the components that are already in place. So there we are on the top rack, and there the crane is dropping things down. And these components are, of course, the building blocks of the structure, and they're generally fashioned elsewhere and brought to the site ready-made. So when it's finished, the skyscraper stands as the concrete embodiment, reinforced with steel and clad in glass, of the abstract geometric principle of pure verticality. And the ground of the site, cleared of debris, and from which everything of structural significance has now been lifted off, is by the same token leveled to conform as closely as possible to the ideal of the purely horizontal. Now, in the contemporary world, the skyscraper model, if we can call it that, has come to dominate the way in which mountains, particularly of a more iconic or spectacular kind, have come to figure in the popular imagination. We tend to think that the mountain is something like a skyscraper, which has been miraculously forged by nature without the assistance of cranes. Indeed, in many ways, the mountain has become an extension of the metropolis. Climbing the highest mountains, like scaling the outsides of skyscrapers, is considered a job for specialists, stuntsmen and cranks. Often the same people do both, using similar gear. For them, mountain sides are glass windows, and their precipitous faces are walls. What matters is their verticality, quantified as height above sea level. And that's why mountains are defined by their summits, and not by the great heaving mass of rock, of which the summit just happens to be the highest point. And it's why mountaineers have to reach the summits in order to claim to have climbed them. Ordinary residents, however, take the lift, or its montane equivalent, the funicular or cable car. So there's the ordinary resident using the lift going up and down. They are pulled up. At the top, they can enjoy the view, or perhaps an expensive restaurant meal, in a glass-enclosed panopticon that is completely insulated from the exterior. Such mountaintop facilities will have been built on the same principle as the skyscraper by dropping materials on top, from on top. However, since no crane yet constructed is big enough to overtop an Alp, the lifting and dropping will have been done by means of a helicopter. Now, real mountains, of course, are not built like skyscrapers, however much we might like to pretend they are. They're not constructed from blocks, but emerge from the tectonic movements of the Earth's crust. Their very forms, though they may seem eternal relative to the span of human life, are but evidence of work in progress, work that was never started and will never be finished. Every mountain range is, in effect, a perpetual building site. The geological and meteorological forces at work in mountain building are many and various, and this isn't the place to review them. The general point I want to make, though, is that every mountain is a fold in the ground, not a structure that is placed upon it. Within the fold, the material of the Earth is thrust upwards, perhaps in the case of volcanic activity even to erupt. And for want of a better term, I shall call this the extrusion model. That's down there. Whereas with the skyscraper model, components are dropped down from above upon a base. In the extrusion model, they surge up into the structure from beneath. And here the ground is raised up by the swelling of the earth, much as the skin by a body. So ground is ground, however steep or however precipitous, and the climber remains in contact with it, regardless of whether he or she is walking, clambering, or abseiling, whether on the slopes or at the summit. Indeed, if we think of the mountain in terms of the topology of the ground rather than pure verticality, then the summit loses much of its allure, because it's no more than a patch of ground that incidentally is higher than those around it. Well, nowadays, many hilltops are being put to other uses as sites for the generation of electrical power. Among both supporters and detractors of these developments, there's a widespread feeling that the ubiquitous wind turbines strike an incongruous presence in the landscape. Could this be because they bring to a head the incompatibility between the skyscraper and extrusion models of building? To support a turbine, it is necessary to prepare a concrete foundation with a level surface that is sunk deep into the ground. The turbine is then mounted upon this surface. But the ground all around is not an infrastructure, it's a fold. Observing the turbine, it's as though we have to entertain two quite different conceptions of the ground, and indeed of the hill, simultaneously. And in order to get rid of the contradiction, we would either have to think of the hill, too, as an edifice mounted upon the surface of the earth. And it's possible, because we think of iconic mountains in this way, that we don't find the same incongruity in the construction of a restaurant or a viewing facility on the top of an Alp. Or we have to think of turbines as having somehow grown like trees from the hill itself, thus belying the manner of their construction. How can it be that the hill or the mountain rises from the ground and yet is ground? I ended just in the last section with the same dilemma in regard, however, to a human-built structure, namely the wall. How come that the wall is both raised upon the ground and yet partakes of the ground? In his book Difference and Repetition, we find the philosopher Gilles Deleuze grappling with the same question. His point is that in becoming different, One thing may seek to distinguish itself from another without the latter's distinguishing itself from the former. Thus, in Deleuze's example, a streak of lightning shows up against the night sky, but the sky does not show up against the lightning. The distinction is unilateral. And this is how it is too, suggests Deleuze, with the ground and the line. The line, he writes, distinguishes itself from the ground without the ground distinguishing itself from the line. It's like lifting up a sheet to form a crease. We register the line of the crease. We see it as something that has an existence of its own, and yet the crease is still in the sheet. It's not as though the sheet had parted company with the crease and sunk back into flat homogeneity, leaving the crease line, as it were, high and dry. So what the crease is to the sheet, the fold, whether in the form of mountain or of wall, the fold is to the ground. But if this extrusion model applies as well to the wall as to the mountain, then could it also be applied to the skyscraper? Let's listen in to an imaginary conversation between the skyscraper and the ground. Says the skyscraper, "Look, I am finished. See how high I stand. Straight up in the air. You, ground, are infrastructure. I am superstructure. I am over and above you. You are beneath me. You may be my rock of support, but without me you would be but a desert, devoid of any form or feature that you could call your own." To which the ground responds, "You may think you are finished, but indeed you are very much mistaken. For whence do you think the materials have come from which you are made? The concrete, the steel, the glass. And do you think they will last forever in the forms in which they are presently cast? These materials have come from the earth, and it is to the earth that they will eventually return. I yield them to you, but only on sufferance, for they remain of my flesh, of my substance. Thus have I risen into your very fabric." The ground here speaks with the voice of the tectonic and in the language of the line. But perhaps the last word should go to the wall, a fold in the skin of the land that has so absorbed the earth into its substance that it is racked by the same tectonic forces, causing it to strain and buckle at the joints, where its members, in their give and take, offer themselves to one another. The strength of the dry stone wall, as Lars Spökbrück observes, lies in its settlement, a settlement that is reached not only in the weighing of stone on stone, in their contact or touching together, but in the stone's collective settlement with the very ground from which they were originally resting. This settlement, moreover, is not once and for all, but has continually to be renegotiated. The ground heaves, and the wall answers with its heft. It's a process of correspondence. And I'll stop there, because otherwise I go on for another hour.
Do we have some questions for Tim? I'm sure we do. Everybody needs a little bit of a minute.
Maybe architects don't usually talk like this. They probably show lots of pictures. Now, anthropologists have this habit of just coming out with that. Yes?
I just wondered if you could talk about the duration of the knot a bit more.
The duration.
Yeah, so it's never a static or finite thing, it's always something in time. Can you talk a bit more?
So, yes, absolutely, because the knot is made up of lines, or lines of some sort. And that's why I got interested in knots, because I was interested in lines. And these lines are either growing, for example, if you were thinking about the knotted roots underneath, in the forest, and you look at underneath the soil, and you find lots of knots of roots of different trees all getting tangled up with one another. Those roots are growing all the time. So the knot is growing, and you're getting that other kind of knot, because as they're growing, they're also swelling and creating those hard nodules. But then there's the other kind of knot that's made out of threads, string, rope, where you've first got to have created this thread before the knot is actually made, and then the knot comes from tying it tight. And that's a way, in the sense of, the difference between those two is that in the one case you've really got this knotting going on all the time. It's becoming. In the other case, it's almost like a way of trying to arrest time. It's like the time has passed in the creation of the world. Now you tie things up, and then if you untie the knot, then it's all let loose again. And this is the nice thing about it is you find in many parts of the world is this notion about untying knots to produce wind for sails. It pops up all over the place. But it's not unlike what you do simply when you burn a log in the fire. That in a way what's happening with the growth of the log, all that energy has been stored up, and then when you burn it, it's released in the heat and the smoke and everything else. It's an unbinding and untying. It's the same sort of thing, that there's some sort of way in which you can wrap time up and then release it again.
I've got a question, or possibly an observation. When you said about when you let go of the rope and it kind of coils down, and the chain just kind of goes down in a one. Surely the rope is a weave or a lay, or kind of it's been braided in that way, which gives it that natural bias. So it almost goes back to your basket makers. So the knot is actually made up from what the basket maker would weave.
Well, that's right. I mean, the beautiful thing about a rope that's made out of some sort of fibres is that you can go down and down and down. You might say, let's say it has so many ply, right? So 4 or 5 or how many strands are made up of it, and so the rope is wound from those. But then you take each of those plies, each of those strands, and it too is wound, and you can go on like that until you get right down almost to the molecules, the long chain molecules, of which the sorts of plant materials tend to be made, which make good stuff for ropes. So that you've got, and I think that's where the memory comes in, because when you flex something like that, then those strands at every level of resolution, those strands are rubbing against one another. There's a friction and a tension. And once you've bent it a certain way, then that friction will stop it sliding back again. It's the same reason why if you take a paper clip and you try and straighten it, you never get it straight. It's always got kinks because it's held in the memory of that. I got this idea from working with a doctoral student, a very brilliant guy who was doing field work on fishing boats, and he found very quickly that the sailors, the fishermen, knew exactly how the ropes and chains have these different properties, and you would use a rope for one thing and a chain for another, precisely for that reason. And you can only, if you want to coil a rope on deck, there's absolutely no. It's a bit like a garden hose. Try to get a garden hose with the hay and coil up the right way. He always insists on coiling up the other.
Could you imagine the metaphors of the building block, the chain, and the container? Could you imagine those somehow being superseded again?
Well, I hope they'll be superseded by the knot. But are you asking what would happen after that, or coming back in another form?
I suppose I'd understood the knot came before.
I see. Well, in a way it did. The knot came before. Then the building. What I understood about the building block is that it came in as a dominant metaphor around about the middle of the 19th century, same time the centre was writing, and it came in because affluent middle-class families were living in houses with dedicated nursery spaces, with level floors that were uncluttered, and they started marketing building blocks for children. You can't have children's games of building block games when everybody's living in a house where there's a big room where everybody's running around all over the place and nothing's going on. In order to play with building blocks, you have to have a level floor and you have to have a dedicated space where everybody's not running around, which is what happened in prosperous houses in at that stage, architects started marketing building blocks for children. The idea came in that you really must have a building block set or your child's cognitive development will be impeded. That goes back to, it's not a very old metaphor. So the knot was there before, and so in a way what I'm arguing is that we should go forward and back. That hopefully we begin to think more in terms of knots. We're not only getting beyond the obsession with building blocks, but also recovering something between knots and knots.
I was just thinking about this idea of a memory in the knot. And I wondered whether you thought that was something that applied to other kinds of materials that might not be so obviously linear or knotted. But I've heard about the idea of the memory of water, and whether there's something inherent in the materials we use in architecture that might not look like knots, but still have that kind of material memory in some way.
Well, I do think so. I think that there are probably all sorts of memory in materials. As soon as we recognize that the materials we're talking about are not as homogeneous as we thought. I mean, in order to have any kind of memory, then there's got to be some, I call it, it's a fancy term, I call it interstitial differentiation, meaning that you've got to have some difference that emerges from the inside of stuff. And if everything was sort of purely homogeneous, then there could be no memory.
What about plastics?
Well, possibly, I don't know with plastics. I mean, I think that would come pretty close to a homogeneous material, but it's hard. Almost any material, if you start looking at it closely, I think actually there is that heterogeneity. What I'm going to say is that to the extent that you can discover difference, heterogeneity, emergent difference within a mass of stuff, then that difference has come about and is a memory of those processes that about in that particular kind of way. So, one particular example that I've been thinking about with my colleagues is ice. We tend to think of ice. So ice is ice, just as water, it's the same anyway. But actually, when you look at the structure of ice, the way the crystals form is always different from one place to another, and it has its own microbial fauna. It has all sorts of. It's actually as rich and as variable as soil. I think the soil has got lots of memory in it of all the processes, all the things that have grown and done and died and so on. Ice, in fact, is just as heterogeneous and contains just as much memory in that sense as soil does. So I think, yes, that it's really interesting to look at materials as stuff that flows and gets tied up alternately, and in doing so remembers the processes of its formation. This is a much more interesting view of materials.
I was just wondering, we all know that when we particularly kind of try to make something, find something, read something, and we know when the material gives and when we want to actually follow the material or do something with the material. The problem with architecture and current kind of building arises with the fact that we are now more and more able to use the software packages to actually test for us all of these things that will come from the outside onto the material and from the inside. And then we don't actually necessarily have to know because the software can do that for us. And then what we do need to know is, and it produces a kind of a certain, you know, it could be a pattern, a joint, a sort of, you know, fold, whatever it will be, which will apparently be trusted to be the most informative condition. So then we send that to our machines to kind of create and count and things like that. So the question is, if we know that, at which point do you think the future of practice is like, not necessarily just architecture, I mean it could be a product design and you know, various other things, would retain the kind of possibility of critically.
I don't know the answer, and
Yeah.
I'm a bit of a technophobe. I mean, if I was a technophile, I would probably say that just as we've been talking about the variable properties of materials and stuff, you can do the same with software.
Yeah.
In other words, you simply displace the problem from the materials themselves, simply cut, laser cut, onto the software, and say that actually we can think of software as a kind of material stuff, and apply this sort of thinking about knotting and weaving and so on to the software itself. And I'm sure there are people who are into that kind of thing who would say yes. The very word soft suggests that software is something that could lend itself just as well to this kind of approach as wood or cement or anything else. For myself, I'm a bit skeptical, and I think that we are losing something very important for not having that direct engagement with the materials from the very start, and that I really would hesitate to say anything about architectural education about this. I know virtually nothing of it. But I know that because I visited an architecture school in Portland, and where they were making a great thing about how they, right from first year, their students were all doing metalwork, woodwork, and really becoming proficient at working with basic materials, even before they really got into the architecture stuff. And they felt this was absolutely essential. In doing this, they were working against the time, and it was a great triumph when their degree program actually got ratified by the professional bodies. But I thought that was a very good thing. But other people might think it was a sort of like a
Well,
nostalgic.
it's an argument in architecture and engineering in particular. I mean, we had before you Mario Campo, who was like a few weeks ago talking about separation of this particular problem, which equally most architects probably don't want to spend a huge amount of time learning how to manage software. I mean, there are other things as well that we like to do. And so, in a way, his argument was to separate the sort of revolution with the engineering to the architecture. Yet, that becomes kind of problematic in the way of the material approach.
But I guess they're architects and architects,
Yeah,
and there's bound to be that variation. It's the same with design professionals. There are some who are actually hooked on computers and software, and everything's digital, and that's their world. And there are others who avoid it as much as possible, and the whole little shades in between. That, of course, that's not that thing.
no.
When we get to a point where the 3D printing is getting to a point where you can print metals and things, when we get to a point where we can print fibres, wouldn't you be able to print something that had the memory of a knot without the knot ever having?
Somehow, I don't like 3D printing. I mean, I can see that it has its uses, particularly in the medical field. Obviously, if with the help of 3D printers we can reduce a a replacement part that is exactly the right shape to fit a patient and it's going to help, then who's going to stand up and say we shouldn't do that? It seems to me that that's entirely reasonable. But I worry that the underlying logic of 3D printing is actually taking us right back to the old style hylomorphism position of form on material. It's right back to the idea that material is just this passive stuff that you can then form in whatever way you want. That's the way of thinking about materials that I've been trying my best to argue against. So I don't like the logic that underpins I don't actually like the logic that underpins the idea of the ordinary printer, the 2D one. That I would much prefer if we were writing by hand and not typing on a keyboard and then sticking our thing in a printer and leaving it to chug. I think it's a horrible reduction or impoverishment of writing taking place because of our obsession with keyboards and printers. So I worry that 3D printing would have just the same effect in spheres of craft.
About 3D printers, there's one type that is kind of industrial when you use like material plastic. There's another one where you can actually print molecules, and they already tested it, and they can create living organisms, like very simple ones, but they sort of printer that prints molecules out of that physical material. What if we instead of printing the material into molecules? So is it too much recreating the essence of it? Probably not.
I could imagine going back a few hundred years and somebody came along and said, now we can have a loom. Now we can have a loom that can which can create patterns. All you have to do is to set up your loom in this kind of way, and wow, this pattern is going to appear. Now we look back on those and think that's just a crafty thing. So maybe actually the argument is not really all that different. There are things we can do that we couldn't do before, well, that's okay. But when it comes to matters digital, my response is that I really don't understand it. Lots of other people out there do, and I'm your own generation.
Is it your understanding from all your studies looking back that our ancient ancestors had a deeper or perhaps different or more profound understanding of the world we live in? Well, it's kind of a very general, naive question, but big question.
Well, obviously, in some sense, yes. That I, how to put it in the best way? I worry that we are losing the sensitivity and the sensibility that comes from direct, relatively unmediated contact with materials, with stuff, even with people. And that one of the reasons, one of the problems that leads to our current lives being in many ways ecologically rather unsustainable is that much of what we do does have consequences for stuff around us, but those consequences are not immediately apparent in the act of our engagement, which is very obvious in the case of energy consumption.
I think I agree that the understanding of what a wall is, the direct relationship to a wall as a teacher here, very difficult to get people to think about what that actually means. It's just a wall.
Yeah.
But the wall can be more significant if it, a field, some closing cat, or sheep, whatever it might be. It's
Yeah.
more immediate.
Yes.
I think that's the distance. A distance.
Somehow I think it is the case that we are. So it's horrible. I mean, anthropologists sort of go blue in the face and they start making these kind of generalizations. I'm saying that we should never do this sort of thing, but still, one of the consequences of hypermodernity, I think, has been to break immediacy, the palpability of our connections with stuff around us, which means that we don't have that kind of sensibility that comes from, and then we have to fill the gap with all sorts of rules and regulations. Don't really do the trick.
So kind of like the abstract separation that comes about with money, in that a craft is no longer like a craft. If you were going to make a chair or a table or something, you would put the craft in. That would be your bartering point, and you have a sense of your time going into it. But the abstraction of money has taken it to a step where you no longer see the other person involved in the production of something, and therefore.
Yes, and what has done is this commodification. The commodity economy means that most of the things that we deal with on a day-to-day basis are not things that we've made. They're things that we've bought. They're commodities. We take money and we've got them, and that means that we use them without any understanding of how they're made, what they're made of, and what the stuff they're made of is undergoing as a consequence of our using them. If we were making the things we use, as in the distant past, most of what people use, they made themselves, they grew themselves. We would use those things with a knowledge, an intuitive understanding of the materials and of what they undergo in the process of our using them. And that, I think, is something that we have lost. And the parallel I often draw is in the sphere of human relationships. If you simply take the relationship between a mother and her baby, a mother is intuitively sensitive to the baby's needs. They communicate with one another just by gesture, by voice, by a very basic kind of way. And the mother knows, oh, this baby needs picking up, or it needs gesture, it's cuddling, whatever it is. You know, because there's that immediacy of contact. And if that is broken, imagine that you didn't have that, then how would you make up for it? And I think it's that sort of intimacy of relations with materials. If you're trying to take it from babies to clay, for example, or pottery, it's that kind of intimacy that we are in danger of losing. And then the trouble is that we try to regain it in rather adult sort of ways, in new agey kind of ways that, in a sense, don't really solve the problem, but make it worse. Yeah.
Would you say it's too late to get back to the state now then? Because if we tried to get back to a state where we were building...
Well, we can't all become hunter-gatherers again. I mean, that would be absurd. We can't turn the clock back. What we should be doing, I think, because I don't want to appear anti-technology. I don't want to be perhaps I am. So the thing is that we've got all these opportunities. There's all this stuff that we can do now that we couldn't do before. And we can do it in a way that enhances. We can use all that technology to enhance the sensitivity of our relations with the environment, rather than to detract from it. But mostly, because of the commodity economy, because of the commercial interest in driving technological innovation, mostly we've been using the technological abilities we have now kind of in the wrong way to cut those relationships rather than enhance balance them. But there are certain things that are going in the opposite direction. For example, I talked about writing with a pen. And I think that there's something about writing with a pen, the sensitivity of contact with the paper, the way that you feel your words flowing on the page, and that all of that is lost with the keyboard, where you have a computer and your printer and everything. But if one could develop pens that are digitally enhanced, such that one's sensitivity to the surface you're writing on could be even greater than just with an ordinary pen, that would actually enrich those possibilities. There are some sorts of things now in smart textiles, I think, developments in smart textiles, which again would actually enrich rather than impoverish the depth of our sensory contact with the world around us. So you can't, I don't want to blame technology. It is actually, as you said, the commodity economy that is the source of, or commoditization, or even neoliberalism, whatever you want to call it. The source of the problem is political and economic. It doesn't lie in the stuff itself or the technology. With a different politics, with a different economy, with a different set of priorities, we can use technology to, in a humane way. Hardly it's for the most part it's not. But in some places it is.
Do you not think that the sensitivity and flow of a pen could be transferred to touch typing though? Because you would get into the rhythms of tapping keys.
I've had a lot of arguments with typists about this. I'm a hopeless typist. And the typists say to me, people who habitually write on keyboard, they say, no, I don't have any problem. My fingers find the keys, dance over the keys. I experience a direct sort of transference of my thought into the paper. You come along and tell me you do it with a pen, I do it on the keyboard. It's just as good. And surely, just as the pen dances over the paper, you can say the fingers of a really good typist dance over the keyboard. But there is still a difference, to my mind, and that is that there is a break. You might say that the fingers dance on the keyboard, but
dance isn't captured by
the dance is not. There's no relationship between that and what appears on the page or the screen. In that sense, it's similar to an organ. It's a musical instrument. I hate the organ because it doesn't matter how you press the key. It's completely different from a piano. The piano, the way you press the key, it's going to come out in the way the note sounds. But the organ doesn't make any difference. If you put your finger on the key and you've got those stops, that sound is going to come out. And it's an instrument that seems to me to be entirely devoid of feeling. But that's because I'm a cello. And think about it.
Just to play devil's advocate, I'm just imagining sort of a Sumerian, sort of accountant with his little hammer and knocking into stone and going, oh, what's newfangled writing? This is too smooth. I just want, it's interesting that you referred to the loom and in the 18th century somebody might have thought this is kind of, how is this going to change our being in the world? So it'd be really interesting to think through this historically, historical stages, and to kind of get a grasp of whether or not what we see now is categorically different to other technological.
Well, many people have argued that.
And I don't know the other, I'm with you intuitively, but I've asked myself the same question.
Yes, no, many have argued that there's nothing all that new about our current predicament, and that we talk about going into the digital age and the rest of it, that there have been other times in history, plenty of other times in history where very similar anxieties have been articulated around other sorts of inventions. So I suppose the reality is that in every case it's the same little thing. There are many things that if somebody were to come from the 5th century or something and see what's going on now and say, oh, we have these arguments too. And they'd say, no, there's this, but I can't really recognize this one. So that they would the two things together.
Well, would it be possible to think of it as
ball 13 goes around and can't come back, the thing that is the engineers on the ground do is take parts from the sort of hoover and things and try to analogically think how to work with this. It seems to me that the current technological advance squashes that time of analogical thinking, testing, because it's not just actual materials, it's also how we perceive the world, which seems also to squashes and squeezes out a certain level of, if you wish, eroticism and pleasure within the time that one takes to test the material, which comes back to the body, the way that, actually the influences from the outside are seen in the joint. And when you talk about the joint in the way of the knot and the ends being on the side and always being in the middle, it's quite interesting because it's really of the human body to me. So I wonder if this squashing and squeezing out of all these time temporal elements that the body needs sometimes in the machines that we're handling now might be a temporal issue in terms of technological individuation.
Well, it is in this.
I don't know. I mean,
it is in the sense that if you start thinking digitally, and if you think of everything, this is what the lines book was about. What happens if you stop thinking about lines as the trails you make as you move through the world, and start thinking of lines as connections between them and people. Then in this distinction there between wayfaring, which is just carried along, and transport, which is going from one point to another point. And as soon as you start thinking of movement in terms of transport, you're here and you need to get there. So then at that point you want to try and make this to get as far as possible to the point where you can be in both places at once. And our technology is always trying to force it in that direction. But it's only because we're already thinking about movement in terms of A to B, rather than simply carrying on. With the question, how fast is life? Can we speed it up? Is meaningless. But the question, how quickly can I get from Brighton to Gatwick? It does actually have a sense. And so all this effort to speed things up, to try and reach this science fiction ideal of teleportation, which we can probably call beam me up, that one, beam me up, where you can actually be in two places at once, is an index of a certain way of thinking about time, which is digital and not analog, and which I think is inimical to life. Squeezes. What's being squeezed out actually is life. Yeah.
I just wondered, going back to the idea of the knot, do you see it as always a productive condition?
Not necessarily. This is a difficulty. I haven't quite resolved yet because you can imagine, for example, imagine that you are a prisoner and you've been taken hostage and you've been put on a chair and you've been bound to and gagged. And you wouldn't then think of that as a very positive or productive state of affairs, and you'd be trying to...
Depends on the perspective, though, because from the captain's perspective, it's very effective.
Maybe it is, but from your perspective, you need to get out.
But I was thinking about the metaphor of having a kind of knotted up stomach when you're anxious about something.
Yeah, I mean, one thing, we do use that before. We talk about knots in the stomach or knots in the neck if you get a prick. And what that implies is that just for momentarily, you feel paralyzed is not the right word, but you can't kind of move. Your will tie you down, and you have to break, and you have a strong feeling that you need to break out. But it is productive in the sense that knot, rather like the tree knot, which is the world, is a concentration. I've compared it more or less to a storm, the eye of the storm. And that eye is a point of maximal concentration from which all the energy is then spiraling out. So it's a tremendous, the knot in the stomach is, it might be uncomfortable, but it's also a source of energy which is about to shoot you off doing all sorts of things and will then in the process be released.
If there's one more question, then we need to know.
I just have one totally side thought, not critical or anything. I'm just thinking about Corderia in Venice. Are you aware of that long brick building that's called after it having been a place of manufacture of cord, basically, for the Venetian Navy? It'd be lovely if you gave that lecture there. Fantastic, because then it's kind of the cord and it's long, so it's basically in a
The rope walk inside.
hundreds of meters long. I don't know, kilometre?
220.
Comment?
Rope comes in 220 metre bales because of the first rope, kind of was 220 metres.
Well, it would be a fantastic stage for a lecture.
That's
10 years in the Navy there.
Was that?
That's 10 years in the Navy, that knowledge.
Oh, you were in the Navy, that's right. Anyway, thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you.